So exactly what is happening here? Is it the gun? Or is there something else that we're missing here that is far, far more important? The real co-conspirator and all of these shootings and many other murder-suicides or just suicides by themselves that don't involve guns. And we're talking to Ann Blake Tracy in this segment. Ann serves as executive director of the International Coalition for Drug Awareness. You can find information at her site, drugawareness.org, where she works since 1992. She has testified as an expert witness in Prozac and other SSRI-related court cases around the world. As a matter of fact, you look at these drugs, the different names, it's just amazing how many of these SSRI-based drugs are. Prozac, Serafim, Zoloft, Paxil, Luvox, Celexa, Lexapro, Effexor, Cerazone, and I could go on and on and on. There are so many different trade names for this, but we group all these together and we call them SSRIs. And she's going to tell you why they're prescribed and what they actually do to people and how they've been involved in the murder-suicides of many people. She points out she has been involved in high-profile cases like the would-be murder-suicide of comedian Phil Hartman and his wife Bryn, Columbine, Red Lake School, Andrea Yates. She was a Texas mother who drowned her 5 children. She didn't shoot them. She drowned them. But of course, let's not pay any attention to this problem that is far, far bigger than the people who are killed simply by guns, because people are dying by many, many different ways, and people are committing suicide, but they don't really want you to take a look at this. But we do want you to take a look at this. So we have on the phone now Ann Blake Tracy. She called in yesterday to the show. She was listening to what we were doing. Very, very informed caller. So we called her back afterwards, said, I'd like to get some information on you. And we found out she was an expert in this very issue. So she's joining us today. Thank you for joining us, Ann.
Thank you for addressing the issue.
Yes, it's been a long time, and you have been on this for a very long time, 25 years or so, 26 years, I guess, since 1992. Tell us, first of all, why SSRIs are prescribed. What are they supposed to do? What's the theory behind this, and for what kind of conditions are they prescribed?
Actually, I think they're prescribed for breathing, but...
like so many other drugs, right?
Oh, yeah, it doesn't take anything. But they're supposed to be prescribed for depression. They prescribe them for anxiety. But the problem with that is that the way that they work is by increasing the neurotransmitter in the brain called serotonin. Mm-hmm. Serotonin is what LSD and PCP mimic to produce hallucinations. Mm. So as the serotonin continues to rise, you begin to have LSD and PCP reactions.
Same mechanism that was designed in LSD and PCP. And so it's no surprise that people get hallucinations. It's no surprise that people want to kill themselves or to kill other people because, this is a severe mind-altering drug. So people come in, they have mental problems. They are depressed. Maybe they are suicidal. So we give them the equivalent of LSD.
That's right.
Yeah, that should work out pretty well. So in reality, then, tell us a little bit about some of the symptoms that people experience when they're on these drugs.
Well, there's like 500 side effects at least listed. Mm-hmm. Fibromyalgia is one because your main function of serotonin is constriction of muscle tissue, and especially smooth muscle tissue. So they're a vasoconstrictor. So of course they're going to be cutting off oxygen to the brain, but they tighten the muscles when you get way too much serotonin. It's called serotonin syndrome. It can kill you within a 24-hour period.
So there's physical manifestations of this besides the mental issues.
Yes, that's what Anna Nicole Smith's young son, Daniel, died from in the hospital not far from this school. where the shooting was. He was only 20, sitting there in a hospital room visiting with his mom and new baby sister, and just dropped dead.
Because he was on SSRIs.
He was not on an SSRI, but he was on 4 different medications that do affect serotonin levels.
Okay. All right.
So his serotonin level was going up very, very quickly.
So tell us what you have seen in some of these cases. For example, let's talk about a case that is not a gun case. Andrea Yates, the Texas mother that drowned her kids, 5 kids that she drowned.
Right.
When you looked at this case, let's talk about, because the left loves to talk about anecdotes. We can talk about health effects, we can talk about statistics or whatever, but let's take a particular story and kind of relate how these drugs affected that particular story. Or another one if you choose.
First of all, Andrea did not have a psychotic break until they gave her an SSRI. The first one they gave her was Zoloft. And she did have a psychotic break. And a lot of people don't realize that Andrea was a nurse. She had walked away from her career to spend all of her time with her children because she knew that she was having her children a little bit later in life, and she wanted to spend as much time with them as she possibly could.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, she had been given Zoloft. She had a psychotic break. They gave her Haldol, which is supposed to be an antipsychotic. And then later, she began having problems again when she had Mary, her little girl. And then her father died. And she was pretty stressed over losing her dad. But they, for some reason, gave her the same kind of drugs again, expecting a different outcome, apparently.
Yeah, and that's what we see all the time.
She was on 2 of these medications at maximum dose. She was taking Effexor and Remeron. And the doctor had her at 1.5 times the maximum dose of Effexor and almost to the maximum dose of Remeron until the day before the tragedy.
Wow.
When he took her down to the maximum dose of Effexor and up to the maximum dose of Remeron.
And of course, the changing of the dosage is one of the things that triggers that. We've got to take a quick break. We're going to be right back with Ann Blake Tracy, drugawareness.org. You need to understand and not just blindly take any drugs that are prescribed for you, like opioids or whatever, but especially SSRIs. We'll be right back. I'm David Knight. Welcome back. I'm David Knight, and we're talking to Ann Blake Tracy with drugawareness.org. She sent me some information. This is something that she recounted, an experience that she said about 2000, the year 2000, she was contacted by a pharmacist who said the nicest woman in town had come to him regularly to get her a prescription Prozac until one day she went to prison for killing her husband. And he said, the symptoms that I see in patients who use and abuse these drugs, these serotonergic, I guess is the way you pronounce it. She can tell us anyway. These serotonin drugs of any form could aptly be described as the Hitler syndrome. He said one's own policies or decisions, no fear of consequences, of criminal behavior, of the death of anybody that is close to them, is a symptom of the abuse. And he said, this is in the year 2000. He said, I believe that in about 20 years or less, this is what I fear, we will be confronted not with one Hitler, but with thousands or millions of them. Numbers so great that we'll be forced to interact with their distorted thinking on a daily basis. He said, one of the insidious factors about long-term serotonin abuse is that it causes a distorted thinking, abnormal behavior, and loss of morality to spread like a contagion. And that contagion is being spread for money. They make a lot of money off of this, and nobody is really talking about this. You would think this would be a sensational story for them to talk about, because it's not just about guns. We were just talking before the break about the Texas mother who drowned her 5 children because she was on these drugs, and they changed the dosage, which typically sets off an incident. Had nothing to do with guns. This is much bigger than school shootings. It's much bigger than mass shootings. This is the mass drugging of our society, turning us into a mentally ill society. You know, we've had guns in far greater concentrations in our society throughout our history. We've never seen this type of thing. The thing that has changed is really the pharmaceutical position that we have in this country. So I wanted to talk to Ann about some of these episodes. There's one on your site, Ann, about why I took a gun to school. And it's about a young man in Denver. His name is Corey. He was 16 years old. He took a rifle to class one day and held 24 classmates hostage. Now, he didn't shoot anybody, but he talks about that experience. Tell us a little bit about that.
All right. He was actually in Washington State.
Oh, okay. Right.
Western Washington. He did go to Denver to meet with Mark Taylor, the first boy shot at Columbine. But anyway, they started him on Paxil because he was shy.
He was shy.
And he was shy. I was.
They got over his shyness. He went in with a gun and held people hostage. So no more shyness. I guess it works then, right?
Exactly. I had one in Israel that was given Paxil for the same thing, and he went out and flew up an army jeep and started ranting and raving about wanting to be a suicide bomber. So,
wow.
Yeah, it works really well for sinus. Anyway.
So this is April 10th, 2001. It's 2 years to the day almost from the Columbine massacre. That was a connection with Denver. Yeah. Go ahead.
Anyway. What happened was they decided to switch him to a Fexer. He was probably having too many reactions to Paxil, so they thought they'd try a new one. So they're switching him over a 3-week period, which is really pretty fast for these drugs. Because usually it'll take you months, sometimes years, to wean properly down off of these. And so they get him to the maximum dose of Effexor on the day this happened. And he doesn't feel very good because he's up to the total maximum dose. And he tells his parents he's going to go back to bed for a while because he just feels sick.
Oh, let me interject something. That sounds kind of like what we heard about this shooter in Florida yesterday. He went back to bed. He said, nah, I'm not going to go in today. And then later on he goes and he does the shooting. Go ahead.
Yeah. And boy, I picked up on that. But anyway, he went back to bed and he doesn't remember anything from then until he woke up in juvenile detention. Wow. What he did was he got up, got a gun that his grandfather had given him years before, went to school, and held his classmates at gunpoint for 45 minutes.
And he had no recollection of that.
None.
And didn't know what he was doing. He's just kind of sleepwalking through this whole thing.
Right. And there is a sleep disorder these drugs cause that is known to include both murder and suicide as you act out nightmares in a sleep state. Wow. And so anyway, he stood there holding the gun on the class, and one of the girls looked at him and said, Corey, what are you going to do with that gun? Are you going to hurt us? And he looked down at the gun like, whoa, there's a gun in my hand. But he would hold it on his classmates, and then he would put it under his chin, and then he would hold it on the classmates and put it under his chin. But finally, luckily, his teacher, who he knew well, was able to talk him into handing him the gun. Wow. And that's why nobody got hurt. But it was scary. And Corey's the only school shooter I know of who's been able to speak out about what happened.
What do they typically do? When we've had this shooter now confess to it, but what do they typically say? What, sorry?
They either kill themselves or they go to jail.
But when they go to jail, they don't typically talk about it?
Well, they can't for a long time because they're facing criminal charges. So they're not supposed to speak out about anything really until their trial is over. And by the time that happens, nobody wants to talk to him.
Yeah, because we've moved on. The news cycle, it only lasts for a few days with anything. We grab a couple of sound bites and move on, and then recycle those through. Let's talk about the money behind this. Because you got another article. Meet Dr. John, is it Verapin?
Yeah.
Okay, the man who bought Prozac's approval. Tell us about that, because the money trail here is very important. That's the key reason why we're not seeing any of this stuff reported on news, because you see all the drug commercials that are on news. They're not going to tell you to stay away from the SSRIs with the news programs when the big pharmaceutical companies are paying for the news programs.
That's exactly right. When I did the Lisa Gibbons show on mothers on these drugs killing their children, as we stepped onto the stage to do the show, they said, okay, you can say the word antidepressant, but you can't say the brand names of any of these drugs because of our advertisers.
Wow.
You got to be kidding me.
Well, let's talk about Prozac. The guy said the article that he bought his approval for Prozac. Tell us about that.
Right. And I did the first show here in America with him as he talked about this, and I actually even asked him how much he paid the guy. he was the lead man for Eli Lilly in Sweden. And Lilly wanted Prozac approved in Sweden because Sweden was known to have very strict guidelines on drug approval. So they knew if they got it approved there, then other countries wouldn't look as closely at Prozac for an approval, and it would just sort of slip right on through.
Yeah, if I can make it there, I can make it anywhere, like they say about New York,
exactly.
Right? In the case of the drugs, it's in Sweden.
Right. So he said, well, how do you want me to do this? And they said, any way you can. He said, money? They said, sure. So he bribed the fellow who was in charge of making the approvals by offering him $30,000. Can you believe that?
Wow.
Plus, he offered him a couple of clinical studies that are worth $1 million or $2 million apiece.
Yeah, but they're making billions, tens of billions annually. You had this article in 2014. It was $11 billion. I don't know what it is now, but we'll be right back with Ann Blake Tracy. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm David Knight, and we're talking to Ann Blake Tracy with drugawareness.org, talking specifically about these SSRI drugs that are given to troubled children, sometimes just because they're shy. And then they do things like hold a gun on their class, not even knowing what they're doing. It's like they're sleepwalking. They're in a dream. They have no understanding of what they're doing to themselves or to other people. And you can go to drugawareness.org and educate yourself, because, look, you're not going to be protected by the government. We can all hope that the government is going to make everything safe for us. But as we just heard before we went to the break, we heard the story of this guy who says, yes, I bought approval for Prozac. Said I paid a guy a bribe in Sweden, about $30,000. We got a promise for a research grant. It's going to bring in about $1 million over 10 years. And then based on that, we could get approval in the United States. Because, see, when we look at the approval of these drugs by the FDA, and you hear these commercials on television talking about a drug, everybody will hear that. And don't you just dismiss all of that long, rapidly repeated list of very serious side effects because you say, well, this is FDA approved, so it's okay. And those side effects are minor or so incredibly rare, they're just protecting themselves for legal issues. I don't really have to worry about that for myself or for my kids. So you just dismiss it. Because if it's state approved, it's 100% safe, right, in your mind. It's like a binary decision. You don't have to worry about the risk. You let the government tell you, oh, this is safe, that's not safe. This is good, that's not good. And just check your mind out at the door. And then you give this stuff to your kids and their minds get checked out. So I want to ask Ann while we've got her here. She's been studying this since 1992 in great depth and detail. She's testified in many high-profile cases. She's been to several different countries talking about this, but it's not something people typically want to talk about, the money involved and how easy it is to get these things approved. But let's talk about what happens to young kids. We've seen what happens to teenagers. Let's talk about what happens to young kids, but especially before we lose it. This is the last segment we got Ann on. Before we lose her, I want her to tell us how you get your kids off of this stuff and what you really should do if you've got some kids who do have some psychological issues, what she would recommend. But real quickly, let's talk a little bit about what effect it has on younger children. Is it the same? Is it worse when they get put on these SSRIs?
It is worse, just as it is also for the elderly, because with young children, their organs are developing still. And with the elderly, their organs are beginning to shut down. So you don't have as good a function as you would at an older age. So, of course, it's going to affect them far more. Their brains are still developing until they're 25, actually. And the FDA finally extended their warnings on twice the chance of suicide, is what they've said with children taking these drugs. They've extended that up to anyone under the age of 25.
Wow. Well, let's talk a little bit about how we can safely get our kids off the drugs, because you pointed out just changing this kid's drugs who went in and took over that classroom over a period of several months, you said was a very rapid change for them. So what is a safe way to get your kids off of these drugs if they're on these drugs?
Extremely slowly. We have a whole bunch of Facebook groups called Prozac should be illegal, Zoloft should be illegal, Paxil should be illegal. And there's all kinds of people coming in there trying to figure out how to come off safely, how to wean very, very slowly and gradually to get off. Usually you have to take half the amount of time you are on the drug to wean off. Unless you've been on the drug 5 years or more, then you can take just over a year for each 5 years on. That's a general rule of thumb.
Wow.
And the reason why, I think, is because of the extremely strong steroid effects that these drugs have, which most doctors have never even heard of, because the research was done in Italy where they wouldn't have to report it here in the U.S. But one single 30 milligram dose of Prozac can double your cortisol levels. Cortisol is like cortisone. So actually cortisol is what they test to see if you're depressed or stressed. And yet one dose doubles it. I called an endocrinologist one day and I said, can you tell me how long the human body could tolerate having the cortisol level doubled on a daily basis? He said, oh my gosh, you can't do that to someone. I said, if you could, how long could the human body tolerate it? He said, well, a month, maybe 2, 3 at the most. Why are you asking me this? So I told him that's what Prozac does. He said, no, it's a wonderful drug. I had to give him the information on how to pull that study up because he'd never heard of it. Here he's an
that's the key thing.
You should know.
Even the doctors haven't heard of this. Instead, they get all the happy news from big pharmaceutical companies.
That's right. That's where they get their education about the drugs.
So what you're saying is this is like, if we could do an analogy here, this would be like a scuba diver who dives down deep and the pressure dissolves the oxygen in their bloodstream. And if you come up too quickly, that'll bubble out and give you the bends, right? So you have to, the deeper you've gone, the longer you've stayed, the more slowly you have to come off of this stuff, because if you come off of it too quickly, it's going to kill you, or you'll kill other people in the process, right?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. I can't even tell you how many people tell me that they feel like they've been deep sea diving and they're coming to the surface as they come off.
Wow.
Or like they feel like they're coming out from under anesthesia, which I've said all along. These should be classed as dissociative anesthetics, just like PCP was on the market for 7 years before it was pulled. Nobody would be surprised at what we're seeing if they were told that these people were on PCP.
So the key thing is that as people start to investigate this for themselves, for their children or whatever, family members, and they start to look at the really dangerous physical side effects of this and the mental side effects, it's like, oh, I want to get off of this stuff. But you've got to now take your time and be very, very slow and deliberate about this, because you can cause far more harm if you immediately start to change things quickly. So that's very important for people to do their research on that, find out how harmful this is, but then find out how to safely get off of this at a slow pace. All right, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Tell us what you would do if you could.
That tells you how to do that as well.
Okay, good. And that's at the site, drugawareness.org, your CD?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you can find these resources there. Now tell people what you would do if you've got a child who has some psychological issues, or what do you think we as a society should be doing in just 2 minutes here?
Okay. Well, as I continued to read research, I kept saying, my gosh, they're talking about blood sugar all the way through here. Finally, I ran across a study that talked about the high rate of diabetes among the mentally ill. And they said very nonchalantly in the beginning, well, we've known forever that mental illness is blood sugar related. I'm going, what?
Wow.
Why didn't you tell anybody? But you look at somebody going into a psychotic break, and it's pretty similar to somebody going into insulin shock.
Wow.
In fact, I had a little girl that flipped out on Paxil at school and tore her schoolroom apart. And when I called to say, please give her some orange juice before she leaves, because I think her sugar level's way too low, the school administrator had answered the phone, and she said, oh my gosh, that's it exactly. And I said, what? She said, well, we've got 2 or 3 children here that are diabetic, and Crystal acted exactly like they do when they go into insulin shock. And she was in withdrawal from Paxil.
Wow. So we look at some of the key things in our society. Yeah, so we look at key things in our society like high sugar consumption, which doesn't just make us obese. It increases the cancer risk, but it also affects our minds. And everybody knows that when they give sugar to their kids, they know how it affects them mentally.
Right. They talk about how hyper they get. They don't realize, actually, Dr. Candace Pert, whose research pretty much made a lot of these drugs possible, and yet she came out against them. She will tell you that sugar is almost chemically identical to cocaine. Yeah.
So instead of addressing root causes and saying, well, let's reduce the sugar consumption with our kids, with our society, instead what we do is we come up with these expensive, very dangerous SSRIs and other big pharmaceutical drugs, which then make the problem far, far worse. But it's a lot of money in that. As we pointed out, this guy, $30,000 bribe, and he personally gets millions of dollars in a contract, and then the drug company gets $11 billion annually. That's a pretty good return on investment. Thank you so much for joining us, Ann, Blake, Tracy. Again, find that information at drugawareness.org.